Kyle, you know what? If it wasn't for the West Coast Express era, you and I probably wouldn't be friends. We probably wouldn't be here on Locked On Canucks. Well, guess what? We got Scott Rintoul on the show today to talk about that legendary West Coast Express podcast. Let's get into that interview. It's Begsy, it's Bhawan, it's Rintoul, and you're listening to Locked On Canucks.
You're Locked On Canucks, your daily podcast on the Vancouver Canucks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm back, baby, and thanks for hitting the play button on today's episode of Locked On Canucks. My name is Trevor Beggs, Canucks writer and credentialed media member for Daily Hive Vancouver. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit fanduel.com/lockedon today to get started. And before we dive into today's legendary episode, we want to thank you for listening to Locked On Canucks. It's your team every day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's episode, again, set it off the top, Scott Rintoul, the creator of the West Coast Express podcast from UNREEL Sports, joins the show today to talk about all kinds of stuff. The Bertuzzi interviews he did, the interview with Gretzky, and just general thoughts and reactions to the podcast. But before I get to Scott, quickly, Kyle, how you doing, brother? Nice to see you again.
Locked On Canucks, your team every day. Apologies for yesterday. I'm going to get more into what happened yesterday on maybe tomorrow's episode, maybe at the end of this episode. Who knows? Who knows? Okay, Kyle Bhawan, Trevor Beggs. More importantly, a healthy Beggs family. Congratulations. I'm sorry. We're sending you love. It's a beautiful moment. It's the most important part of life, and I'm really proud of everything your family's accomplished here, supplying the world with better human beings every day. Even though we're doing the interview, don't get us wrong. Okay, Locked On Canucks, your team every day. We're gonna get to the comments at the end of the show as well. Beggsy, one love, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it, buddy. And yeah, baby Henry Kaz de Beggs was born Monday morning. So stoked, man. And he came at the perfect time because, we got home late Tuesday, and now I'm here to talk to you and Scott Rintoul. So let's get into it on the other side here. Scott Rintoul joins the podcast here on Locked On Canucks. We're thrilled to be joined on today's episode of Locked On Canucks by a former Sports Page alumni and, of course, the creator of UNREEL Sports West Coast Express podcast, Scott Rintoul. How you doing today, buddy?
I'm very well. Trev, Kyle, thanks for having me in.
Of course. And I got to say, two of my favorite voices that I've ever heard on radio and podcast are here together on Locked On Canucks, Scott and Kyle. I know it's a magical moment for me too. I love both your voices. So really looking forward to this conversation. But but Scott, first and foremost, just kind of wanted you to touch on, your inspiration for putting this podcast together and the time frame. How long did it take you to kind of get all the interviews and everything all wrapped up?
I think we're going to need some calculations ongoing while I'm doing this. We might need Beautiful Mind coming in. I don't know how many hours it took to get this project done. The inspiration actually isn't a hockey podcast, and it wasn't necessarily the story itself. The inspiration actually is a podcast called Fall of a Titan. I'm not sure if you guys or any of the viewers or listeners have ever heard of it. It's the story of Steve McNair. And many will remember Steve McNair as a quarterback of the Tennessee Titans, played for the Baltimore Ravens at the end, and he was murdered. And so it was a true crime podcast meets a sports podcast. And I listened to this a number of years ago, and not that I wanted to do exactly that, but what struck me is that we didn't have this type of storytelling very much in the sports world, at least in audio form. We've had it in television documentaries. 30 for 30 is likely the most recognizable series of that form of storytelling, but we didn't have much of this in the audio space. So that always stuck with me. Then I came to the thought one day, it would make a good story, the West Coast Express. Just the initial premise. Look, you've got three different players who are drafted by three different teams. They get acquired by three different general managers and somehow wind up on the same line. Just the odds of that, if you were to do calculations, are minuscule. But then they become the best line in the National Hockey League and take the Canucks out of this abyss that they've been in, the lowest of the lows in the late 90s. The chances of that happening are so small. So it's very it's a very compelling story on that level. And then you start to dig into some of the backstory and some of the highs and lows, as you guys know, and any of the listeners will know. It's not just when they won or when they scored that it was spectacular. The way they lost was super memorable. Like, you can go through a lot of teams in NHL history that did not win, but you might not be able to say who they lost to in the first round or how they got ousted in the second round. Nobody forgets how the Canucks went down or how they won. Like, it was such an incredible time. So I knew it was going to be a compelling story. But then as I dug into it more, the scope of it just expanded far beyond what I had originally thought. I thought it was going to be, okay, we'll tell the story of when these guys got together, the few seasons they were together, and then that'll be that. But I realized at some point in the process, if I don't educate people on where this team was and how they got there toward the end of the 90s, they won't understand the impact that those players had, not only on the market and on the franchise, but on the entire National Hockey League. So that's why it ended up being a 9-part series.
No, that's something else. And how you alluded to the Steve McNair podcast as, a sports podcast that meets like a crime podcast or one of those like murder mystery podcasts. I feel as if you kind of did that here with this as well, because of the way it was scored, but also because of the incident. There was a criminal aspect to it to some extent, and that's the Steve Moore incident. And I just want to know where you were when that happened and how you felt, because you've been around longer. When I saw that happen, and it was brand new, something that catastrophic in sport, like something that damaging, and I didn't know the repercussions. I just thought maybe a 10-game suspension, 15-game suspension, but it was so much bigger than that. Was there something that you compared that moment to? And again, where were you?
There's nothing that I can think of right now that I compare the moment to, simply because of how big it got. Like, it transcended hockey, it transcended sports in North America. As I detail in the podcast, Oprah was talking about it, which, if anybody knows what the Oprah Winfrey Show was in its heyday, that's far outside the realm of what was ever discussed on that program. That just shows you the extent to what you got. News stations all over North America were talking about this the next day. Where was I? I was in the press box. I was at that game. And I thought when I was putting that episode together that I would at some point inject how I saw it, what happened from an objective point of view, and how it made people feel. But Ian McIntyre summarized my thoughts and encapsulated them so perfectly that I didn't feel the need to inject my voice and my perspective. But yeah, I was in the building, and it was a very strange environment that night. And I've never seen anything like it in sports. That's why I don't quite know what to compare it to, because being there, people forget that when the incident first happened, when the blow was struck, the crowd roared because their team's getting blown out. This is the guy that had hit their captain, and the crowd was there for it because they didn't expect, as none of us expected, the consequences of what happened. And then that place went as silent as I've ever heard or seen a sporting venue when the pile finally unfurled and there was blood on the ice and Steve Moore wasn't moving. So I've never experienced that type of emotional swing, even from an observational point of view. You're doing your job, you compartmentalize when you're reporting at the time, but I've never seen anything like that. And it was a really difficult episode to construct because of that emotion. And I never wanted this series to be a relitigation of that case. It was a telling of what happened through the lens of those who were on or close to the Vancouver Canucks. This was a docu-series, not a documentary. And I do think there's a difference. So it was a really difficult chapter to do. It was a difficult incident to ask Todd about, to ask Marcus about, to ask Mark Crawford, Brad May, go down the list. Like, it's a hard thing to talk about. And we're almost 20 years later.
Yeah, and maybe I'll ask you about that specifically, Scott, because, talking to Todd Bertuzzi about it, it had to be pretty tough. How did you go about that? And then, maybe on the lighter side, how did you find your conversations with Todd Bertuzzi? Because obviously there's that dark cloud kind of hanging over everything he did in Vancouver. But at the end of the day, he's one of the most memorable players to ever play in this market.
No question he is. And I think that's why it's important to listen to the entirety of the podcast and even hear Todd Bertuzzi in the bonus episode, which was just released in the roundtable, because you hear a different person than the one that you may remember in Vancouver. So asking Todd about it was not easy. And you can hear the exchange between me and him in the podcast. And it wasn't an easy thing for him to talk about, in part, and I don't want to go spoiler on this, but in part because he doesn't remember certain things around that time for reasons that he did not want to get into, which is fine. But what I think you find with Todd Bertuzzi now compared to then is that you've got a far more vulnerable individual and somebody that, if you're a believer in rehabilitation or self-betterment, self-improvement throughout the course of your life, I think that's the person we find now. That's what I found in talking to him, that there's a humility there, there's a recognition and a groundedness there that perhaps wasn't there, not just right in around that incident, but during the heyday of Todd Bertuzzi when he was in his prime. He's a different person now. I think we're all different people after 20 years of living on this planet and experiencing different things. But I think you hear a far more vulnerable person, which to me is part of the compelling aspect of this story.
Yeah, and it being Todd Bertuzzi being like the main character or the antagonist in this story just makes it live forever. And it's based on what Trevor said at the end. Bertuzzi was known not just in the market, but around the NHL as the outlier, the player that every team wanted. And he was so good offensively as well. Can you compare anyone since Todd Bertuzzi to Todd Bertuzzi? Because I still can't.
It's hard to find a guy. Yeah. It's hard to find a guy. Like everybody would say, just from a physical standpoint, Tom Wilson. But Tom Wilson isn't as offensively talented and as gifted as Todd Bertuzzi was back in the day. And Todd Bertuzzi, with all due respect to that particular incident, on a regular basis, didn't run afoul of the law, if you will, of the NHL with the regularity that Tom Wilson has. So I think there's an aspect of a Tom Wilson. I think there's an aspect of a Matthew Tkachuk, but certainly the frame on a Matthew Tkachuk is nowhere near the size of a Todd Bertuzzi. I think there's aspects of players, but he is such an outlier, and you might want to call a unicorn. He is that prototypical dominant power forward that every single team searches for and wants on their roster, but most find impossible to either develop or to ever draft.
We're going to get back to that conversation with Scott Rintoul in a second. But first, we need to tell you to make your way to FanDuel, because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Kyle, you know what? The NBA season, it's over. I said Nuggets in 5. No big deal. Make sure you listen to my advice on NBA, big-time NBA fan over here. And even though the NBA season's over, they got futures for next season. Denver Nuggets lead the way, plus 460 to win the NBA championship next season, followed by the Boston Celtics at plus 500 and Milwaukee Bucks also at plus 500. My Portland Trail Blazers all the way down at plus 13,000. But no matter who you're betting on, make sure you're doing it at FanDuel, because when you bet on FanDuel, you get great promotions every day. The app is safe and secure, and you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on all the NBA action than on America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Yeah, just such a unique player. And, Kyle and I talked about it a couple weeks ago here on Locked On Canucks. I would say he's probably the primary reason I became a Canucks fan. Actually, the first goal I ever remember, my first ever Canucks memory, was just a random goal he scored back in 1998, sniping it. And ever since then, been a big fan. Much as I'm a big fan of this podcast you've done, Scott. So I want to ask you, now that the podcast has been released in its entirety and that bonus episode has been included, what were your thoughts to some of the reactions you got for the podcast? And in particular, was there anyone who reached out to you, or was there a particular reach out that stood out to you?
I can't name names in terms of the reach outs that have stood out, but I was overwhelmed to a certain extent with the feedback. And I'll take you back to before we even released this. I'd been working on this project for quite some time, wasn't sure when we were going to distribute it, what form it was going to take when we actually put it out there. But in late November, I said, okay, coming early in 2023. And I just sent it out as a tweet. And I thought, well, a few people will see that and they'll think that's great. But the response to that tweet was so much more of a tidal wave than I ever expected. I couldn't believe how many people went, I've been waiting for something like this. LFG, get this to me now, hook it to my veins. This is going to be incredible. And I'll tell you, there was an emotion inside of me that went, oh man, this better be good. Like people's expectations are really high. I was, I'm doing my best to put out a product, but I realized that the expectation of the fan who wanted to listen to this was really high and set the bar really high. And so it added a bit more pressure in putting this project together. And I'm proud to report that the feedback we got along the way and that I received personally along the way was tremendous and overwhelming to a certain extent. The ones that stick out are the people saying things like, look, it's allowed me to reconnect with my dad. We watched this era of Canucks hockey together. We haven't really talked about sports in a bunch of years, but I heard about this. Now he's listening to it and we're talking about each episode every week. And we've actually reestablished this sports connection. And sometimes that was from grandparent to child, all the way down to a grandson or daughter, where they were all listening together and they were going through this era and they were all excited about the same thing. I had another young woman reach out and she said, you probably have no idea, but this has reconnected me and my friends. A bunch of them have moved away, some in different parts of the world, but we all grew up with this and it's caused us to start a dialogue again. Like I love hearing stories like that. Obviously the feedback that comes in, hey, the production is tremendous. This is so much better than I expected. I love all of that, but hearing that real human interaction and the further dialogue that it's created among people, that's pretty special.
Yeah, I think it's easy because there's so many of us that are, Canucks, they put out that slogan for a long time, and the Canucks were a pretty prevalent team right after the West Coast Express. And again, the slogan was, we are all Canucks. And I feel as if at this time in our Canuck fandom, we're kind of disconnected with being with the Canucks because the stuff on the ice doesn't matter. Like they're just not successful. Winning is not existent in this part of town. And it was kind of easy to fall in love with the idea of this coming out because we needed another reason to connect with the Canucks. And that happened for me, for real. I feel as if you didn't just get me back into falling in love with the Canucks, but also just getting back into love with listening to hockey talk constantly. The podcast was done extremely well. And I think I talked about this a couple weeks ago. Okay. And if this is a spoiler, I am sorry. But the fact that you had Wayne Gretzky talk about this line was like the icing. Because again, I became a Canuck fan because of the West Coast Express. I always thought of them as the best, and the Canucks have never been the best. But here's the best player ever, even talking highly about Naslund, Bertuzzi, and Morrison. What was it like talking to Gretzky about the West Coast Express?
Pretty surreal, but that goes back to how I got Gretzky on. And that's a perfect example, actually, Kyle, of how this podcast evolved. I had no idea of including Wayne Gretzky in this podcast originally, but as I started to go back and I was looking at significant events, that to me, when they tried to sign Wayne Gretzky in the mid-90s, was this clear signal to everybody in hockey, hey, we're going to do this differently now, differently than Vancouver's ever operated in the past. So when I originally wanted to put something in on that, I reached out to Wayne Gretzky's agent, Mike Barnett, who was happy to talk about it, but Mike Barnett still works for the Rangers, and the Rangers wouldn't grant him permission to do it because he was talking about another club, even though it was more than 25 years ago. So I went, I guess I'm at a dead end. Well, actually, I know a guy in media who knows Wayne Gretzky. So I reached out to Darren Dreger, and I said, you guys are pretty tight. Do you think he would do it? And he said, I have no idea, but he does like talking about the history of the game. So there's at least a chance. Why don't you send me 2 or 3 questions you'd want to ask him? I'll send them to him. I'll send you your contact info. No promises whatsoever. He calls or he doesn't, but it can't hurt. And so Darren was awesome enough to do that, and I really appreciate it. One day my phone rings, and we all get this call on our phone where it says whatever city in whatever state, and you go, okay, I'm not picking that up. That's a prank call. But it came up as California, and I looked at my wife, and it was in the middle of summer, and I went, I'm going to take this one just in case. Like, you never know. And it's Wayne Gretzky on the other end of the phone. And I pick it up and I immediately go outside because I'm like, I can't have my kids being too loud in the background. I need a little bit of privacy on this one. So I start talking to him, and the most humble guy ever on the other end Hey, so I heard you wanted help. Oh, it's not a book. It's a podcast. Well, that's okay. I could do that. And he says to me, we're going to LA. I've got to go work for a couple of days. I'm coming back home on the weekend. Can we set something up for Monday? And my heart sank because I was off to Europe on the weekend to go to a friend's wedding. And I went, I just got and lost Wayne Gretzky within about 3 minutes of actual time. And I said, Wayne, I'm actually taking my wife to Europe on Saturday. We're going for a friend's wedding. I'm really sorry. Monday's not going to work out. We're gone for 10 days. The best response you could hear was the one he provided. He went, oh, I had no idea. Take your wife to Europe, have a great time. And well, you've got my number now. So when you get back, just send me a text or give me a call and we'll set something up. And it was the weirdest feeling in the world to have Wayne Gretzky say, you've got my number now. Just like somebody at your fantasy football league draft would say to you. He's saying it as nonchalant as that. So he was gracious. He was extremely well-spoken, as you guys heard on the podcast, and very generous with his time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great story, Scott. And maybe I'll ask you one more question about Gretzky quickly. I mean, you kind of knew the background about him almost becoming a Canuck. You know, was there anything new you learned from that? Were you surprised about the depth he shared about him almost becoming a Canuck?
Yeah, there were two things that stood out to me and that I learned. One, I had no idea, and I don't think anybody really had any idea that he got an offer from the Dallas Stars.
Yeah.
He revealed that in this podcast, and I went looking for information on that afterward. Like, how had I missed that? I couldn't find any. So that was a little bit of news breaking that Bob Gainey had actually offered him a contract. And then the other part of it, it had long been rumored that the Rangers would always have this opportunity to match or better the offer that the Vancouver Canucks gave. And George McPhee, who just won a Stanley Cup with the Vegas Golden Knights, actually said that in the podcast that, hey, I found out later that the Rangers would have had an opportunity to match. Gretzky dispels that. He says, that's not the case whatsoever. He says, I was never going to use the offer as leverage. I went there to make a deal. And I believe Gretzky's account. And it's not that I discount what George McPhee said. He probably heard it through the rumor mill, like a lot of people hear a lot of things. But the fact that Gretzky flew to Seattle with his agent on their own dime, you don't do that when you're Wayne freaking Gretzky unless you have actual desire and intent to sign a contract. You don't. He showed up there. He went in there with good intentions. It was a poor tactic in the middle of the night to try to pressure the guy into giving a decision without talking to his family, and it fell apart. And for Vancouver Canucks fans who wonder what might have been, yeah, it sucks, but that's what happened.
Yeah, and it's in terms of George McPhee and that story. By the way, if you haven't heard Unreal Sports West Coast Express, got to go check it out. What are you doing?
What are you doing listening to this? Go check out that, okay?
In terms of McPhee, I think it's human nature, right? Like if something doesn't go your way, you kind of look to justify it some way, right? And that was kind of my takeaway when I heard McPhee talking about that. But hey, it is what it is. We got Mark Messier instead of Wayne Gretzky. It's I was going to say it's all good, but the pain I think is still felt in this market a little bit.
Well, let me ask you guys a question then, because you brought up Mark Messier. You guys have heard the podcast, and not to spoil it for anyone who hasn't, but when you heard people talk about Messier, even though he didn't participate in the project, did it change your view on him whatsoever with his time in Vancouver?
It did. It did, because I didn't grow up in that era following the Canucks. Again, just turned 30 years old, okay? But all I've heard about Messier was the worst things, how he was the worst this, the worst that. The hate on Messier is something else. It's something else here. It really is. He's probably the most hated player in the NHL from Canucks fans. And then when I heard the podcast, I feel as if I connected different to it because of what the players were saying about Messier. And it doesn't surprise me because maybe we're not used to it here, but that dude's a winner. That dude's a winner. He's won more than a lot of NHL players, and it sounded as if the players kind of respected that. That being said, so much of the dynamic of whatever the Canucks were broken when he was brought here because of the captaincy, and just everything kind of just broke apart. It was more than just Messier, but again, my perspective on him did change.
Yeah, and for me, I think the one thing that stood out most was actually Todd Bertuzzi's comments about Mark Messier, because again, my favorite player growing up, I don't really remember Messier in Vancouver. Again, like Kyle said, a bit before our time by a year or two. But hearing, Todd Bertuzzi say glowing things about Mark Messier did kind of help me change my tune a little bit, because again, you just think the worst about this guy, and there's reason, there's justification for it. But at the end of the day, he was a good influence on players like Todd Bertuzzi, and that made a difference for this team in the long run.
Yeah, it sure did.
Yeah. Scott, I want to ask you again, we talked about Gretzky. I think that interview, obviously a highlight for you in this podcast, but maybe aside from Gretzky, who did you enjoy interviewing most?
That's hard to rank, quite frankly, because there were so many people I interviewed and they were all so different and brought something different to the table. Like, I'd have a bunch of tied for first. I mean, how do you not enjoy listening to Brian Burke and dropping some of the lines? Like, even the small ones that Berkey drops, when he said, yeah, we called Bert 7-Eleven because he was always open, right? Like, little nuggets like that. He's always known how to make a great soundbite. Honestly, my biggest takeaway is that those three guys trusted me. So I love the fact that they were willing to spend a lot of time to share their story with me, and Todd in particular, because we haven't heard that much from Todd until recent years. And that's a tough road to go down. And there wasn't anything big in this for Todd. Like, it's not like I called these guys and said, hey, here's a bunch of money if you do this. Not at all. I said, here's what I'd like to do. Would you guys want to be involved in it? And they were all willing to do it. So I don't think I can rank somebody at number one. Sedin's provided fantastic insight. Dave Babbage had some humorous stories. Tommy Larscheid is always a blast anytime you talk to him. So go down the list, and I don't think that there's one that's set apart. Gretzky obviously differentiates himself simply because of his stature and the fact that I didn't expect him to be a part of this. But outside of that, I think it's a lot of tied for firsts.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Scott. It's there were so many great interviews along the way, and again, we're going to say it a couple more times here before we get out of here on Locked On Canucks. Go check out Unreal Sports West Coast Express, the podcast. Just amazing work by one of the city's finest, New Westminster Zone. Scott, is that right?
It's not New Westminster Zone.
No.
I think people think that because, like, my phone, for whatever reason, was registered in New Westminster when I originally got it like 20 something years ago. And so, like, on the phone, it might come up like that. But no, I'm not from New West. I grew up in Kamloops. I've been in the Lower Mainland for, I don't even want to count the years now. 30 years, basically. So yeah, I'm the North Shores Scott Rintoul now.
There we go. There we go. Yeah, that's where I got New West from too, was when we talked on the phone a couple of months back. A couple more questions here, Scott, and then we'll let you go. What's next for Unreal Sports?
Really good question, and it's TBA right now, and I guess TBD. I haven't determined what the next project's going to be. There's a number of them that I've considered taking on and pursuing, and quite frankly, I didn't believe that the next season would be hockey. I thought it would be a different sport, and it still might be a different sport, but there've been a couple of recent connections and conversations that have made me at least press pause on that and say, okay, I should consider whether or not hockey is the next season. So I'm going to see where those conversations go. So I'll leave you hanging in suspense, mainly because I'm hanging in suspense right now. Here's what I do know. I know there's a lot of really, really good sports stories out there, and too many of them don't get the light of day because we're living in this era of, well, if you didn't win, what does it even matter? Which is ridiculous to me. Like, it's ridiculous to me because let's just use the NHL. 31 teams didn't win this year. Does that mean none of the great stories matter? Does it mean the players who inspired kids or people who weren't watching hockey prior to this to now start following the game or following those players, do those not matter? Like, that's the very essence of sports. And that's part of the reason I wanted to tell a story about a team that made an impact without winning a Stanley Cup, because we celebrate those teams all the time and they deserve their due. But I think we weight it a little too heavily compared to impact, if you know what I mean.
No, I know what you mean, because the Canucks never won, but look what happened. Like, this conversation is not even happening without whatever happened with, again, a team that didn't win. Like, good moments, strong moments, real moments, memories that I'll remember forever still happened. Okay. I think we should end the conversation on this note. Okay. I got a great question. I've been so excited to talk about this with you guys because I feel as if it's really polarizing, but if you had one game to win, which line are you playing? Like, which line are you counting on? Is it Bertuzzi, Naslin, Morrison, or is it Henrik, Daniel, and Burrows?
Which era are we playing in? That might help us solve the riddle.
Oh man, what era? Okay, can that not matter here? Can that not matter? Let's not make it even more complicated, okay? Because I feel as if it's a one game thing, I'm picking Henrik, Daniel, and Burrows.
It's a tough call. Again, and part of
Yeah.
it, like, again, you can couch it a bunch of different ways because, like, who are they playing? Is it a physical team? Like, so if you want to go back to
Ooh.
the pinnacle for the Sedin and Burrows line, like in a series that was officiated the way that 2011 was, Bertuzzi would have been fairly useful. You know, like if you're going to let them go and let people get pushed around and punched in the face, like that line would have been pretty useful at that time as well. So you
Mhm.
can argue it a bunch of different ways. It's tough. Like I think overall for longevity, you end up giving the best line in Canucks history to the Sedin line. They both won scoring titles. One of them got a Hart
Yeah.
Trophy. That never happened for the Bertuzzi, Naslund, Morrison line. However, you can argue it's the most exciting line in Canucks history. And I will say this, as is mentioned in the podcast, no Canucks line has outscored that one in a single season basis. Like that's still the highest scoring season. We're 20 years removed from it, but 02-03, if you add up Morrison, Naslund, Bertuzzi, it's higher than any other trio that played together in Canucks history in any one season.
Mhm.
Yeah, for me, it's a really tough one. I think my gut was to go with Bertuzzi, Naslund, Morrison, but you know the Sedins and Burrows had a bit of that clutch gene in them, which you know if you're trying to win one game, that's really what you want. So I'd
Yeah.
probably lean the Sedins and Burrows, but that's a great question, Kyle. That's why they pay you the big bucks here on Locked On Canucks.
No, 100%. That's why they do it. And I think it's great that we had this conversation and, we ended on that question because this is one of the true projects that kind of archive that time in our lives and just in hockey in general. And again, having the Gretzky cosign, in my opinion, goes a long way because this was before YouTube. This was before everyone had camera phones. So there actually isn't that much footage on the dominance of Bertuzzi, Naslund, and Morrison. So I thank you so much for archiving it in this way and getting the interviews and working and making sure everything was just right because this is not just for the West Coast, the best coast of Canada. This is for the NHL. Like real talk. This is some great work and some real history done by you and your team.
Well, thank you very much, and you're welcome, I suppose, to your thanks to me. I'm glad that you guys enjoyed the podcast and appreciate you guys taking the opportunity to spread it far and wide as well.
Yeah, thanks again, Scott. I know everyone knows you here in this market, but anything else you want to plug or say before we let you go?
No, just that this series is available on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, and every episode is uploaded on YouTube. The first 9 are audio only, but you can find that on YouTube. And then the 10th bonus episode, if you want to actually see Marcus, Todd, and Brendan in video form, you will see that entire roundtable on YouTube as well for that bonus episode.
Fantastic stuff, Scott. Thanks again for joining us here on Locked On Canucks.
Thanks again to Scott Rintoul for taking out his time. Again, go check out West Coast Express by UNREEL Sports. UNREEL Sports, or is it just Unreal?
It's Unreal Sports, West Coast
UNREEL
Express.
Sports. I'm telling you, just a really, really entertaining audio program. For real. Program, series, call it what you want. It's just something that you can escape to, you can fall in love with, and just blessed to have it wherever you stream podcasts. For real. I love escaping. You know me, Begsy. I like quality entertainment, and Scott Rintoul and company did a great job. A great job. And I think it's something that not only allows me to possibly go back to it whenever I want because I'm just a sports nut like that and a big time Canucks fan. It makes me even more excited for what's to come out of that studio, that production team. So again, one love to Unreal Sports and Scott Rintoul.
Yeah, he did a fantastic job kind of laying out some stories for us. And honestly, it's the best podcast series I've ever listened to. And
Whoa.
I'm a biased Canucks fan, so it is what it is. Locked On Canucks, your team every day. You and I, Kyle, know we're eating, living, and breathing Vancouver Canucks, both present and past. So make sure you go check it out. Scott Rintoul, Unreal Sports, West Coast Express podcast.
Boom, boom. Yeah, we're just promoting a lot on the episode, and it is what it is. Well, it's because why, Begsy? We lead with love. We lead with love, and I got to say this, just understanding what's been going on in the Vancouver media market or with sports and people who follow the Canucks. One thing I've realized about that side of the world is everyone's really, really nice, really, really supportive. It's really tight knit community here. I know there's a lot of animosity amongst the fans and whatnot, but it only happens because the Canucks suck. You get what I'm saying? But everyone who talks about the team, reports on the team, I feel as if everyone's good stuff, and I feel as if a big reason for that is because of Jason Botchford, man. I feel as if he spread a lot of love. For real, he was top dog, one of the best in the NHL, and I feel as if right when he was getting that clout and recognition and that push to stardom from the NHL and the people, he immediately followed that up with even more love to his neighbors and his community. So just want to appreciate that and put that out there. Speaking of the love, right? We got to talk about this all the time at the end of the show. Comment Corner. Comment Corner, the best part of the show. And I think I got a couple comments here, okay? So some great ones. The first one comes from Yogesh, okay? Did a solo episode a couple days ago. And Yogesh said what? My man, I'm already laughing, okay? Yogesh said, my man Kyle is killing it. And I said, thank you, bud. And here comes Pipe, okay? I think his name's Jay. He said, not in a good way. Way too many bleeps. Come back, Begsy, okay? Come back, Begsy, and look who's back. Begsy, okay? Hey, we're a fan first show, all right? Then the second comment, it's even better, okay? He does it again. He just goes after me. There is no loss in the Vegas Golden Knights name. And I replied with, I'll take that loss. I'll take that loss. It is what it is.
Man.
This guy has it out for me, man.
What did he do to this Pipe guy? That's unbelievable,
name's
man.
Jay.
Yeah. What did you do to this Jay guy?
It don't matter, bro. Who cares, man? Like us or not, hate us or not, agree with us or not, love one more than the other or not. Who cares? Who cares? Why? Because we're all Canucks. It's all good, baby. It's all good.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you stepping up there on Monday's episode, Kyle. I enjoyed listening to you talk, even though you couldn't say Alexis Lafreniere. I appreciated it.
Hey,
buddy.
but at least I was honest. Alex,
Alex from New York.
Alex from New
Like
York.
He's calling into a sports radio show.
Oh
This is
man,
Alex from New York.
Hey, had to do it, man. Had to do it for Alex. So you never know. Maybe he's, maybe he will get traded here. Come on, man. Got to respect the guy. You know what I'm saying, bro? It is what it is. You know what? I am going to tell the people though, why there was no episode yesterday. And you know what? Family first for Trevor Beggs. I'm sorry. Fan first for me. I've said that many, many times. But yesterday, something did impact the family on this side, and it required immediate attention. And there was no real time for me to do an episode. This all being said, when I found out the news and I saw that I had to be somewhere ASAP, there was still a little window for me to make an episode, okay? So I did attempt to make an episode, but it was hard to do so because the person involved was the reason why I fell in love with the Vancouver Canucks too. It wasn't just Todd Bertuzzi. It was the dude in my family, the only one that really, really, really loved hockey and made sure somebody else would get that, passed on to them. And it was this person who was involved yesterday. And I was doing the episode and I mentioned how I had to do the episode because it times out with what's happening with Vegas and Florida, right? One of these teams is going to win a cup before my uncle does. My uncle who's been on this earth for a very long time and the most passionate Canuck fan. And it made sense for me, maybe for me to like get those feelings out, but it was hard to do so. And rightfully so, ran out of time, had to jet. As soon as I went to go visit the uncle, I swear to you, the first thing he said, this is it. We are all Canucks, right? The first thing he said was, I can't believe Las Vegas is going to win a Stanley Cup before me. What are the chances? Yeah.
Holy man, it's
he's in there. He's in pain. He's getting better. Yeah. It's all love. He's going to be great. But it was just ironic. And that's why the Canucks have to get better and get better now, because people have been waiting and people deserve better, and we deserve hope. And hope is something that allows us to escape. And sometimes we need to escape from life and feel passionate about something else. I know some people think sports are a complete waste of time and fandom is a complete waste of time. No, you don't get it. It's what life is all about, for real, that feeling. And we want that feeling to be fulfilled. And after 6 long years, the Vegas Golden Knight fans finally got their wish. And I'm not going to lie, it's cool. It's great. It's going to grow the game. It's going to make sure Vegas is around forever and there's going to be fans forever and the game's grown great. Okay, who cares? We still don't got one, and I'm a little mad about it.
Yeah, geez, there's a lot of emotions packed in that
Yeah.
statement, Kyle. But first and foremost, what one love to your uncle, sending him health and good wishes, and I know you listen out there, you're sending the same Kyle's way. Again, we
Mhm.
appreciate you tuning in here on Locked On Canucks. In terms of Vegas, I mean, a lot of Canadians on the team at least. Mark Stone again, one of my favorite players in the league. That's a non-Canuck. So I was kind of happy to see him get a hat trick and lift the cup, even though I don't really have any, positive
Mhm.
feelings towards Vegas. But kind of lastly on the camaraderie of sports, I think Scott touched on it on this episode, right? Often it's sports is what brings people together. And, Scott talked about how, people reached out to him saying, you helped me reconnect with my dad, my granddad, my friends. That's the power of sports. And,
Mhm.
hopefully there's something mixed in here on Locked On Canucks along the way, whether you're it every day or whether you tune in occasionally, whether it's your first time listening, that kind of makes you think and maybe reach out to someone in your life about the Vancouver Canucks because
Mhm.
sports, it's an amazingly powerful tool for bringing people together. And Kyle, I know it's what brought you and I together as well.
Yeah, for real. There's no lie about that. It's an emotional story too. Me walking across the classroom just to shake Trevor Beggs' hand because I noticed that he actually liked the Canucks too. It's an emotional thing. It's a fine line. If Todd Bertuzzi is not a Canuck, are we friends? I don't know. It's crazy how life works. Okay, Locked On Canucks, your team every day. Let's sign out, Beggsy, man. You've been here for way too long. You got a second kid, man. You are fan first. You are fan first after all, and that's dope, man. Okay, and that's why you should subscribe and hit the like button. That's beautiful, man. You made the switch, and I'm proud of you.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. It's good to be back here on you, and I'm glad I made that conversation with Scott. That was a fun one. Hope you enjoyed listening to it. Whether you're an everydayer, an occasional listener, or a first time listener, we love you. We appreciate you tuning in. Coming up this week on Locked On Canucks, we wanted to talk about Podkolzin and Höglander. Who's going to have the better NHL career and who's going to have the longer career with the Vancouver Canucks. Also going to get into some draft stuff as well. But for now, I got to go see my 2-day-old son and my wife. So I'm going to get out of here. I'm Trevor Beggs. That guy's Kyle Bhawan. And you've been listening to Locked On Canucks.